If you like Inglorious Treksperts, you'll love the 430 movie, available wherever you listen to podcasts or at 430movie.com. Join us every week as we program exclusive fantasy theme weeks full of the movies you grew up on. Hey, this is Mark A. Altman.
And this is DAREN DOCHTERMAN, and we are the
Inglorious Treksperts.
All stations, red alert.
Oh no, the Borg.
Prepare to evacuate the station now.
It's time to begin.
We've jammed our shields. We have no defensive capabilities.
Brace for impact.
There's a lot of damage down here.
All we need is a little time.
Fire quantum torpedo.
The Borg have entered the facility.
Resistance is futile.
Hey, this is an all-new episode, and we're thrilled to have you join us again for, I bet you're wondering what today's episode is going to be about, unless you read the description.
I don't think they're wondering. I think they know exactly.
They know exactly what they're in for? Borg again. Resistance is futile.
Or
I'm not.
is it?
I don't have that Don LaFontaine growly cool voice.
Next time on the all-new Star Trek The Next Generation, the Borg are back.
The Borg are back. Yeah, and look, here's the thing. The thing about the Borg that's so interesting is for a long time, Star Trek was sort of coasting on villains past. It was bring back the Klingons, bring back the Romulans. Next Generation had some success, certainly later on with the Cardassians, which Deep Space Nine. But we'll talk about all that. First, I want to introduce you. We have a very special guest today. She was executive story editor on Voyager, wrote some of its greatest early episodes, and is a big, longtime Star Trek fan. She had a great time at the Los Angeles Comic-Con a couple of weeks ago. You worked on a bunch of cool sci-fi shows, including Flash Gordon, Earth Final Conflict, Lisa Klink.
Hello, happy to be here.
Welcome.
And it's great to have you here because, of course, we're going to be talking about Voyager, which is a show that hasn't gotten a lot of love from this group so far. But, in the way that I think that Deep Space Nine really define the Cardassians, Voyager was a show that in a lot of ways really began to define the Borg. But before we talk about that, we played a little clip from the Borg invasion in Las Vegas. And I know both you and Rob have a little history with Las Vegas and
We should
Star Trek.
also mention that Rob Burnett is with us.
Oh my God!
I just beamed in.
Introduce Rob Burnett. I'm so sorry.
I'm
Rob
like,
Burnett is here.
I'm like Gary Seven. I just materialized from somewhere across the universe.
Well, last time I looked, I just saw this little black cat, and now all of a sudden Rob is here.
That's true.
Rob Burnett is also joining us, and Rob, of course, is a regular on the show. And Rob is not only the writer, director, and editor of Free Enterprise, he also was one of the producers responsible for that fantastic VAM on Star Trek The Next Generation reissues as well as Enterprise. And
That's value-added material for you folks
yeah, it's
out
bonus
there.
features. And producer on Agent Cody Banks, and he is the producer and star of a new YouTube channel that he created called Robservations. And, there are few people who are more schooled in the history of Star Trek and more delightful to listen to hold court about what's right and what's wrong with Star Trek than Rob, particularly when he has a drink in his hand. No sorry and brandy for you today.
No, but thank you for that introduction.
Yeah, no, I apologize. It was belated, but
It's good to be here.
I really should, work on these introductions. It's putting me behind the.
So anyway,
dais
the
here.
Borg.
The Borg, yes, thank you, Darren. Well, I wanted to talk about Las Vegas because, of course, Lisa wrote the second ride film, which was the Borg invasion, which followed the Klingon encounter. Rob.
No, I mean, well, I guess it was called. Yes,
Yeah.
it did follow that.
At
it
the
was
Star Trek experience.
At the Star Trek experience, and yes, I guess they called it the Klingon encounter. But yeah, I worked on that I cut all the videos that you saw in the
Museum.
In the museum.
Yeah.
And for a year and a half, that's all I did. It was the greatest job I ever had. Like every single day before I even edited, for four months, I watched 10 episodes of Star Trek and digitized them into the computer before we could start editing.
And I would hasten to add, got paid for it as well.
And I got paid for it, and we actually shot the Vaughn Armstrong. He played the Klingon captain in the Klingon Experience. We shot those segments on set on the Deep Space Nine episode Shadows of the Empire, or Soldiers of the Empire. Pardon me, Soldiers of the Empire. And
Shadows of the Empire was something else.
Something else,
Completely.
different thing. And that was an episode LeVar Burton
Prince
directed.
Ezor.
So when we were setting up to do that shoot, it was after they were wrapped that same day. I got to watch LeVar Burton direct, and it was the moment when they all sang that Klingon shanty. It was really exciting. And then, of course, we spent a year and a half working on it, and it was amazing. But we weren't there. I was gone by the time you did the second. They wanted to add that second ride film.
Brace for impact.
Fire quantum torpedo.
The Borg have entered the facility.
Resistance is futile.
Borg Invasion 4D. Now open at the Las Vegas Hilton.
Because weren't they running concurrently? You could either go on the Klingon adventure or the Borg adventure. And I have to say, as an old veteran of Las Vegas, I really enjoyed the Star Trek experience.
Yeah, me too.
I thought
I
it
did
was
too.
super fun. They had the restaurant Quark's Bar, which had better fries than Dive.
They had the magic rings of Beta Z.
The magic rings of Beta. What was on that menu? Do you remember? They had some...
I only remember some of them. One of them was the magic rings of Beta Z, which were onion rings, and they were very, very good. And they, of course, the drinks, they had the warp core breach.
Oh, yes.
Which was presented in this almost like a fishbowl of booze that they would hand you, and it was very lovely.
Yeah.
Plus, the transporter effect that they had created was one of the coolest things ever, because talk about suspension of disbelief. You would step into what you thought was a room, and they would just pull using a counterweight.
Well,
they would pull.
They would black out, so you don't know what's going on.
Right. But they would pull the walls up.
Yeah.
And the transporter set was around you, which you didn't see because the walls were smaller. And when they pulled up the walls, you would feel the air rush in. So it actually felt like something happened to you.
You just destroyed the illusion. I thought that they had actually invented teleportation technology for that ride, and now you just ruined the whole illusion for me.
Sorry.
You're like,
Thanks, Rob.
Joe Bluth.
I know, but the first day we did it, I was back and forth as they were building the museum and stuff. The first time we did that, when they had the thing all ready to go, we had to test it. I teared up a little bit because it was so cool. I was so excited. It was just, I'm like, how did you do that? I felt like a
Extremely
little
well done.
kid.
And what was
well
incredible is they also made the Enterprise available for weddings and bar mitzvahs as well. In fact, I think you had considered having your wedding on the bridge, but
true.
You ended up doing it at the Sci-Fi Wedding Chapel instead because it was just... they capped the number of guests. It was a guest thing.
Yes,
you couldn't
you're right.
accommodate enough, and you had so many friends and family that you couldn't fit them on the bridge.
My name was actually on Yar's or Worf's station, the horseshoe. My name was actually on one of the LCAR's displays.
As a do not admit.
And it's so appropriate that they would have the Next Generation Bridge at the Hilton because, of course, it looked like a Hilton. So my thing, I would also ask you, one of the things I loved about that ride film was when the Bird of Prey is over Las Vegas and, you're like over Las Vegas on the ride. It was just super fun. Now, I remember the ride film you did, which was also a terrific fun. And I love the way it maintained the sort of in-universe of it all. Mm-hmm. How did you were on the show at the time. Do you remember how you got approached to write that ride film? And maybe tell us a little bit about how it's different writing, sort of a film like that, 10-minute, audience involved kind of ride attraction from doing an episode, which requires a more thought out narrative.
Well, I remember that the ride creators, producers, I forget which company it was.
It was Landmark. Yeah.
Landmark approached me and said that they were going to do this, Borg ride film, and was I interested? It's like, yeah. And I really remember sitting in this big conference room with a bunch of, I guess, executives and engineers and designers, and talking about, kind of walking through the ride, and, it was going to be, this shuttle that was going to be grabbed by the Borg and pulled into a cube, and then we were going to actually have the Borg Queen, which I thought was really exciting, and that she was going to assimilate the guests. And they were going to do this effect where you saw on the 3D screen, these nanotubes, I guess, shooting out of her fingers, and then they were going to have something poke out of the chairs to in the back of somebody's neck. And I remember having this conversation for about half an hour about whether it was going to be too scary, whether we were going to actually give somebody a heart attack thinking that they were being assimilated by the Borg.
It was pretty scary. I have to say.
It was pretty intense.
Scary. It was a lot more scary than the time I got turned into a minion at Universal Studios. That was not quite as traumatic as when I got turned into a Borg.
But it was a lot of fun, I gotta say. Just talking about, the budget obviously was bigger than most episodes, and so talking about how we were going to do the point of view and coming up with the concept of avian drones, which we had never been able to do on the series, of course.
Sure.
But we figured it makes sense. There's got to be some alien species that fly that get assimilated by the Borg, so let's have some avian drones. Cool. And then the other fun part of it was getting to write for the Doctor. Everybody loves writing for the Doctor because Bob Picardo just knocked it out of the park every time. He would make things funny, whether they were funny or not. And so getting to write for him, both in the line and kind of explaining, what was going on, and then getting to write for the Borg Queen was fantastic. So it was really a fun experience.
Yeah, Bob Picardo is, I had a chance to work with him, I think, as well. And he's just a delightful guy, super fun, super talented. You wrote one of my favorite episodes with the Doctor, which was Message in a Bottle, which I think he's great in. It was a great, early season episode. So I want to ask you, because, we're talking about the Borg invading Vegas, but, the Borg really became the seminal Star Trek villain, and what's so interesting was because in the early days of Next Generation, Roddenberry was very much against even having a Klingon on the bridge. That's how much he wanted to resist sort of the old tropes of the original series. And it was David Gerrold and Bob Justman, DC Fontana, that really argued that this is a great idea, because this is still during the days of Glasnost. The wall hadn't even fallen, to show the Klingons now working with the Federation. It was a really powerful statement in the best of the classic Star Trek moralizing. And then you had, then they said, absolutely, we're not going to bring back the Romulans. By the end of the first season, everyone brought back the Romulans because it just nothing was working. And you have it ended. It was a big prologue, that episode. The finale was, if you remember, Neutral Zone. The whole episode basically builds up to we're back, and then second season nothing. Yeah. So you have that, but so it was really clear that Star Trek needed a new villain. And they got one in an unjustly overlooked episode. People always say, oh, best of both worlds, but they forget that it was Q-Who that introduced the Borg, and it arguably might still be the best Borg episode, second season.
Next time on Star Trek, The Next Generation, the evil Q returns.
What do you want, Q? My purpose is to join you.
No. And Picard faces Q's wrath when the Enterprise is hurled into a living nightmare.
We have an intruder.
Now the crew is helpless against an invincible race of alien killing machines.
You can't outrun them. You can't destroy them.
On Star Trek, The Next Generation.
What do you think, Rob?
Well, it's funny, when we were working on the remastered Next Generation episodes, that was one we really wanted to see, because it was the first time you saw the interior of the Borg cube, and they had there was a great matte painting that they redid for a digital matte painting that they redid for the restoration. But what I loved about that episode was, to me, that's the only episode of Star Trek really where the Borg lived up to their promise of what they really are. And to me, the Borg were always scary because there was no central hub. There was no. They were literally like a swarm of locusts
Right.
that didn't have some kind of hive intelligence behind them, and they hadn't been humanized, and they were just terrifying.
Right.
That episode is terrifying. When you open up the drawer and there's the little Borg baby.
Yeah.
Yeah,
And you
that is
realize
creepy.
that it was really, really creepy. And the way they would just walk past the crew when they beamed onto the ship, to the Borg cube, they didn't care. I mean, the Borg have no. I always thought that it was artificial intelligence gone horribly wrong. Like something really bad happened somewhere, and technology ran amok, and that's the result. And the result of it was they just didn't care. They just wanted to assimilate more. I always saw the Borg as neurons, mobile neurons, and that's what they were. That's it. And they were part of this expansive brain that really just wanted to take over all biological and technological distinctiveness and add it to the big brain, and eventually it would have encompassed the galaxy and then eventually the universe. And that's what I always saw it as, and that was it. And as we moved through this, through all the series, the Borg became more and more and more human-like. We had to add Unimatrix Zero, and we had to add these poor people that can come back from being Borg, and to me it was like they're not scary anymore. It was scary because they weren't an individual. It was a force.
And you couldn't reason with them because there was no one to reason with.
No, there was no one to reason with. They were like an artificial intelligence that had become almost like a hurricane or some kind of a natural evolutionary force of nature for the everything bad that could happen happened.
Well, I think that with any villain, the more you explain it, the less scary they get.
Sure.
I think about Silence of the Lambs. Hannibal Lecter was terrifying. And then once you had Hannibal, he got less scary. And then the TV series, sorry, Brian, also, he just became, again, more human and more understandable and less terrifying than he was in 15 minutes in Silence of the Lambs. And I think it's the same with the Borg, that the more you explain them, the less intimidating they are.
Well, it's interesting because you said something about the ride film that you were concerned potentially, it could be too scary for the guests. And the thing I like about Q-Who is the one time the Borg are really scary. And it's a combination of the music and the eeriness and the fact that, and the Enterprise loses in that one. If it wasn't for the intercession of Q, they would have been destroyed.
Right.
They're impossible to beat. They're impossible to reason with. Eventually
and
in
it's
every
something
other
that
episode,
mankind was totally not ready for.
Not
like
ready
you said.
for. So it captures sort of the danger and weirdness of space. And it's a real credit to Maurice Hurley, who, the late Maurice Hurley, for coming up with them. You look at it now, you say cyborg, Borg, cyberpunk, okay, it's sort of cheeseball. But the execution, Rob Bowman's direction, and certainly Ron Jones' magnificent score that really elevates that episode and makes it something special.
Yeah, and it was great because you also had Guinan and Q in that episode as well, which was the Borg were enough, but then you realize that Guinan and Q knew each other. There was a lot of interesting
layers.
stuff, a lot of layers to that episode.
You have that scene where they're going like this to each other, right?
And it was a lot of it was a lot of fun. I mean, there was a lot of Star Trek mythology laid down in that episode that they would revisit.
That's why I'm always surprised that it's often overlooked. People always go back and talk about how Best of Both Worlds, the show that changed Star Trek. And it did in a sense that, in terms of dealing with character, it's
and it did in a sense that it actually made people want to come back for the next season.
Right, for the next season, being a cliffhanger. But, Q-Who, is a pretty, and it's in a desert of terrible shows. I mean, the second season is not a particularly strong season. And
except the Royale, right, Mark?
Oh, man, that hurts, Rob. That hurts. Matter of Honor is pretty good. The Klingon exchange program, and so there are episodes that are good.
And the idea of the Iconians is introduced in the second season,
which is a better concept than execution. That's a great thing. It's also Maurice Hurley always talked about how Times Squared was going to be the prelude to the Borg, and then now it's just this total mess of an episode. But whatever. So we go from Q-Who to Best of Both Worlds, which to many people is considered the best Next Generation episode. Either that or Yesterday's Enterprise. And if you ask most people, how do you feel that sort of cemented the Borg as Star Trek's primary antagonist? Darren's like, don't look at me. I like the Klingons.
I think that's when the Borg started to go, for me, downhill. because they had to give they turned Patrick Stewart, which was brilliant, turning Patrick Stewart into a Borg, but then it gets turned into Locutus, literally a spokesperson. Like the Borg suddenly need a spokesperson.
The mouth of the Borg.
Right, which means, okay, then that presupposes that the artificial intelligence...
He's the Huckabee Sanders of the Borg.
Well, that the hive mind or whatever the Borg is made this decision, like contemplated somewhere that, if we're going to assimilate Earth, we're going to need a spokesperson. Well, they didn't feel that way about all the other the creatures that they'd assimilated before now.
You don't know that. They might have had spokespeople for other aliens.
Well, that's true. You are correct. That is true. But it just, to me, it was like, once you put, it was cool to see Patrick Stewart turn into a villain. That was really cool.
I think I know what you're trying to
terrifying.
say. I think once it turns out that the Borg have to do something to deal with us in a different way, that means that we are more of a threat to them, and they aren't as powerful.
Yes. They were no longer scary to me.
Mm-hmm.
Not as scary as a faceless, mindless horde that's going to come at you, and there's nothing you can do about it. They were essentially the cancer of the universe, and it was a virus that you could not cure.
Mm.
And, it was like zombies in a way.
Yes.
Sure.
That, if you get bitten by a zombie, you turn into one. And the individual is not quite as scary as the massive horde that is going to follow.
Absolutely true.
The zombie analogy is actually a really good analogy that I hadn't really thought about. And it is. Because literally when they assimilate you, it's like the zombie mythology. I think the problem you have then after Best of Both Worlds, and I really love the first best part of Best of Both Worlds because, to me, I think the Riker drama is very interesting with him and Shelby, and the problem that's going on there, whether he's going to move on, and that all comes from the feeling that Michael Piller had at the time, whether or not he would move on. And they say sometimes write what you know. The best stories come from something you're passionate about, and instead of writing these sort of techno nonsense, for lack of a better word. This was coming from a real human dilemma. In this case, it was Michael's. And, he's deciding, do I want to be pigeonholed in Star Trek? Do I want to keep doing this? Do I want to use the sort of stuff that I got out of Star Trek, the fact that it's getting good reviews and that I've come and I've turned the show around, and I want to use this to move on and do something else. Plus that third season was almost killed a lot of people. There were a lot of, as much as people look back and say, oh, this is a season where everything changed on Star Trek, behind the scenes it was brutal. And
as Ira Bear told me, he said, when I arrived for season 3, it was already in the toilet.
Yeah,
that's what he said.
Yeah. And Ira, of course, walked away at the end of that season, eventually being lured back, and very reluctantly. But so Michael was really struggling with a lot of these things in his own life, whether to move on, whether he had accomplished what he set out to do, and that's all in the Riker character. And the conflict with Shelby, played brilliantly by Elizabeth Dennehy. Then you have. He decides, oh, I am going to come back. And the funny thing is, he set up an impossible situation for himself with the cliffhanger, thinking he's not coming back.
Right.
So let someone else figure it out. Well, he got stuck having to figure it out. And it's not nearly as satisfying, part 2.
Yeah, you sense a little bit of backstepping on the premise.
Well, and also, that was the one thing that defined the Borg, the Best of Both Worlds Part 2, is that you could no longer be a Borg. If you were Borgified, you could then suddenly be cured of your Borgism.
Right.
Yeah.
And that was to me, that was the end of the real end of the Borg, because the entirety of Borg involvement all the way through the end of Voyager was all about human beings coming back from being Borg.
Does that count as a pre-existing condition, Borgism?
I just want to say just a little bit about something that people may not realize the connections with. Sometimes people say that the look of the Borg owes a lot to H.R. Giger and his sort of biomechanical design. I have to say that I think a lot of it actually comes from Captain EO at Disneyland.
That's interesting.
Because you have a queen and her minions, pop out of the walls and the columns, and the planet looks like the Borg planet. It's all covered with stuff.
I may be able to validate that theory, because who they wanted to cast, who their first choice and first contact for the Borg Queen was.
Angelica Houston.
Who was the Queen in Captain EO.
Interesting.
So you heard it here first, folks.
But, and then, the problem, unfortunately, is, how sparingly are you going to use the Borg? Because unlike the Klingons, which could come back multiple times a season, or even the Romulans, you say every time you bring them back and we win, it diminishes them as a threat. So you bring them back in Descent, I Borg, which is a very slight story. It's a Jonathan Del Arco is a Borg.
Hugh the Borg.
Hugh the Borg, who humanizes the Borg even more. And then it's funny because I didn't get that either. Apparently, I wasn't watching carefully enough. But the idea that they have a chance to kill the Borg, to wipe the Borg out of existence. Of course, Picard decides not to do it, which is what I love about the Battlestar Galactica episode, where they're given the same choice, and Adama and Mary McDonnell are like, "Fuck yeah, we're gonna." It's only because Hilo gets involved that it doesn't happen. But that was what was so great about Battlestar Galactica. Battlestar Galactica was always doing the opposite of what Star Trek did.
But that was. Also, in I, Borg, you have Picard making an impossible choice. He's going to commit genocide. And obviously, because of his own experience, he can't ever make that choice because he did come back. And he's like, all of these people could possibly come back. And I think it would have been more interesting, like you just said, because he was a Borg and he knew what the threat actually, what it was. He should have been like, we can't risk it.
See, that's so much more interesting because then later on they wrestled with the consequences of Picard's rape, for lack of a better word. I mean, that was the word they used in the writer's room. It's like if Picard had been, we're going to wipe them out, and like Riker and everybody else are like, you cannot commit like that is a much more interesting story. Yeah. But the problem is, again, this misinterpretation of the Roddenberry mantra that there can be no conflict between our perfect humans in the 24th century. But that's drama. And that is a far more interesting version of I Borg than the one they made.
Well, they could have called John Anderson and gone back to the third season episode, The Survivors, and said, look, you know what you did to the Husnak? Why don't you
save that
for
when we do underappreciated? Because I think we have to do Star Trek's most underappreciated episodes, of which The Survivors is clearly one. But Rob and I love that episode, and no one else does. So we'll have to talk about it. You know which one we're talking about?
I'm not actually real up on my original series episodes.
No,
this
is Next Gen. It's the third season episode where there's this old man and his wife.
Oh, I do remember that one.
Living in a house.
Okay,
and they're on location, and
they're the only house on the planet.
The only house. Everybody else has been wiped out, and the Enterprise thinks maybe they're collaborating with the aliens.
Don't spoil the episode.
Okay. Anyway, too late.
Spoil it.
We both love that episode, and I'm not quite sure
Frakes,
why.
By the way, Frakes loved doing that because John Anderson had played his father. Was it North and South, I think?
Yeah, and he's so good.
So good.
And there's location filming. They're not on these fake stages. It's like, it looks good. It's just, everything about it is great except the name, the Husnak. Who came up with that?
But back to the Borg thing.
Back to the Borg, already in progress.
With that episode, though, it then became the Borg were forever made to be human. Whenever you saw, they were no longer the Borg. They were the species that they used to be before they became assimilated by the Borg, and they could go back to being that species again.
Right.
But there was an interesting thing, I think it was in First Contact, where Picard is basically, tells, I guess, Alfre Woodard to kill one of the crew members who's being Borgified, and he says, you'll be doing him a favor.
Imagine a race of beings possessed of one mind, driven by one will, intent on one purpose: to seize our past and control our future.
Set a course for Earth. Maximum warp.
Now, one captain against orders.
Red alert! All hands to battle stations!
Must succeed where all others have failed.
It looks like the control deck's 26 up to 11.
They have assimilated more than half the ship.
Surrender yourself or we will destroy your ship.
The line must be drawn here.
On November 22nd, resistance is futile. Star Trek, First Contact.
So in a way, you could argue that Picard would have wanted to destroy all the Borg because he would have known that the individuals who had been Borgified were suffering.
Right. Yeah. No, absolutely. And I think one of the problems ultimately with Picard, suffering is that it was dealt with so well in one of the great Next Generation episodes, Family, which followed the Borg arc, which that Best of Both Worlds two-parter, which is so phenomenal. It's such an atypical show, but it's all about Picard coming to terms with his Borgification. And it's a terrific episode, written by Ron Moore. I forget who directed it, but it was good, so it couldn't have been Cliff Ball. It was just a wonderful, wonderful episode, and there's great performances and just really, really wonderful episode. In terms of Picard confronting what had happened.
And even better if you enjoy wine.
Yes, and if you enjoy wine, then you will really enjoy that episode. And then, of course, the last time that the Borg make an appearance in Next Generation is Descent, which was an attempt to recapture the magic of Best of Both Worlds. And if you loved lore and data lore and brothers, guess what? He's back for more. So let's not just make it about the Borg. Let's bring back lore, too.
Yeah.
Anyone? Bueller?
What a shattering disappointment Descent 1 and 2 were. I mean, I was so excited, by the way. That episode makes not a lick of sense. There's a brand new Borg ship that apparently the lore-led Borg have built. How did they do this? Where did they come from? I mean, it's
the same way we kept replicating shuttlecraft. Clearly, they had a really huge replicator.
A really huge replicator. But what I really hated about Descent 1 and 2 is that lore is the messiah of the Borg.
Yeah.
That these disenfranchised Borg that have been cut off from the collective are now wandering around somehow. When you are Borgified and then you become unborgified, your mental faculties come back to you. And apparently you're left in some childlike state where you cannot function. I don't know why this was the case, but this is what there's a lot of Borg mythology being laid down here. I thought in my mind bad Borg mythology. And then Lore comes along and he becomes the messianic figure to these and then they start following him. I mean, if there's any way to emasculate a villain, this was the way you do it.
Wouldn't it have been more interesting if Lore had become a Borg? Because it was always about Sung wanted his children to become more human.
And
so the idea that Lore, who was more of an android, becomes more human by becoming a Borg. Right. I don't know. It's just like there's so much you could do. Although, why do you need Lore? It's all this Borscht Belt, Brent Spiner bullshit. It's like, who needs that? I mean, they keep bringing back the doppelgangers. I mean, they did it in Nemesis. It's like, I don't need to see Brent playing multiple characters. I know everybody loves to see that, but it wasn't that entertaining.
Sometimes you need a big Brent break.
Well, I mean, I think, look, a lot of this had to do, too, with when you spoke about Michael Piller. When he came on in the third season, what he did was the greatest thing in the world for Next Generation, is that he made the conflict not about what was outside, not these external threats, but they always had to be, his mandate was these stories had to be about our crew. Everything had to be filtered through the eyes of our main characters, which I thought was brilliant, and it made Next Generation from the third season on the wonderful show that it became.
On Voyager, I remember that he would always ask, who is this about? Mm-hmm. It was like, which character or characters is it about? Whatever else the plot was, it wasn't what's the story, it's who.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Whose story is it? Always.
And that's when the Borg, I mean, for the Borg, in a way, by making them more human is much more of what a Michael Piller kind of the influence that he brought to the Borg when he wasn't there when Q-Who was done.
Well, I think also Michael was a much different person than Hurley. Hurley was a Machiavellian, sort of nihilistic, son of a bitch. I mean, that's who Hurley was, And so the Borg reflected his personality, whereas the Borg of Next Generation reflected Michael, who was a much more, he's a family man. He was he was a thoughtful, kind person, and the evolution of the Borg sort of reflected the kind of person that Michael was as a kind of the person, just as the way that later on the Borg reflected Brannon, who sort of became the way that Ron Moore was the Klingon guy. Brannon sort of became the Borg guy. Which we'll talk about. But first, we have to look at First Contact, because after Generations, which was a critical and financial sort of in the middle, it could have gone either way. It wasn't clear whether or not Next Generation would have the legs to be a franchise. They knew they had a lead with their the next one had to be their Khan in a sense. It had to be their biggest villain. That it had to, have scope and be big. So the decision was made very early on to do the Borg and do time travel, the two things that have worked consistently for the franchise. Now, originally the plan had been to do time travel to like Renaissance England, or and Patrick put an end to that really quickly by saying, "I'm not going to run around in tights. I've done that enough in my career," and so. They then, said, well, Berman didn't want to do the 20th century because he felt it was hokey to come to our time. And we could talk about that. But you did Future's End, which brought the Voyager cast to contemporary Earth, which the shows hadn't done since the original series.
And I agree it was a little hokey. I think I tend to agree that putting it in the present, first of all, it dates it more. And I do think it was just a little bit hokey to try and, especially like the Sarah Silverman character. No slam on Sarah, but I mean the character I think was meant to represent 20th century people.
Right.
And that's an awful weight to put on a particular character.
Right. Anyone to represent that. Yeah.
Yeah. So I think I tend to agree that setting it in the present is awkward.
I read an interview with Sarah Silverman once where she says, I get recognized a lot still after all these years for that Voyager. And I can always tell when somebody's going to come up to me and say, I loved you a Voyager. She says, I know exactly who that person is. So funny. Get a life. But
I think it was a really good choice in First Contact to kind of incorporate the Trek history of the First Contact. I thought that was a really good choice.
I mean, the original plan when they did the marketing materials was to call it Star Trek Borg. And I remember at the time, Sherry Lansing says, what the hell is
what's that? Yeah.
What's Borg? We're not,
is it
a tennis player?
Yeah.
And she said, we're not calling it Borg. And that's where First Contact came from.
Right.
And then they say, well, that's an episode of our show. And it's like, who cares?
But no one cares.
No one cares. But First Contact, I think, really cemented the Borg as this sort of legendary antagonist for contemporary Trek.
When I was writing for you for Sci-Fi Universe magazine, I don't know if you remember.
Yeah, I remember.
I mean, no, the article I was going to mention, I wrote an article with Dave Hargrove, why First Contact was the worst Star Trek movie.
Wow.
And yeah, I was very angry when I first, not as angry as you were when you saw Generations for the first time.
Nobody's ever been as angry in his human existence as when I saw that.
The movie, look, Frakes did a great job directing. Like you said, the First Contact with the Vulcans was great. I loved the First Flight of the Phoenix, Goldsmith's score. But to me, it was a big rehash. It was this rehash of what we'd seen in Best of Both Worlds with the added Alice Krige as the Borg Queen, who admittedly was awesome.
Yeah.
She was amazing, and when she gets put together, that one effect shot when her torso is sort of dropped into her leather dominatrix suit.
Into her Cenobite outfit.
I mean, all that stuff was really cool, but again, it just further took the Borg away from suddenly, there's a femme fatale Borg. And while it was cool, and then Picard's running around, like you had mentioned earlier, killing his own crewmen. Just get rid of him. I mean, he'd been brought back. He knows full well that these people are not. He'd already stopped Borg genocide.
Right.
And now he's just, no, kill them all. And it just, as I watch this, I'm like, wait a minute. You've already dealt with everything in this episode, this film. You've already dealt with it more beautifully in the TV show than you're dealing with it right now. And it was Ron and Brandon wrote that. I
think it was a really smart decision to use the Borg at that point.
Absolutely.
I think that it was, it belonged to Next Gen. This was something that it wasn't them going back and mining the mythology of the original series. So they owned the Borg, and like using the Borg was, John does a great job directing it. And you absolutely could make that argument that there's things that are too redolent of the series or plot threads that had been resolved. But, coming on the Abomination, that's Generations, it really engaged an audience. It did great, financially, critically. It was well liked. It really gave a pulse to that Next Generation franchise, and it validated the Borg as antagonists, I think.
But on the other hand, you also have to sort of take a step back and say, this plan that the Borg had is really not good. I mean, why would they go back to this time? You know, why? When they could go back, you know, to medieval England or, you know, wherever. It just doesn't make any sense that they would have to stop, you know, mankind at that point.
Well, if you're saying that mankind, that they saw us as more of a threat than most other kind of aliens, then preventing us from becoming the center of the Federation, that would make all of the other species easier to pick off, presumably.
I suppose, but the thing is that they're actually, you know, dealt with fairly easily in the film. That, you know,
the Borg are?
Yeah. And it doesn't really take much activity from our crew to foil their plans. And, you know, with the rickety rocket taken off and the Vulcans seeing, oh, hey, look there's new people in the neighborhood. It just seems really flimsy.
I want to go back to the thesis of our podcast, which is about celebrating our love of Star Trek. And I think that if we go down this rabbit hole of what doesn't work about First Contact, we're going to get to a very dark place.
Well, no, but
you opened the door.
Look, I think, though, that like you'd said, the movie's fun. It's a lot of people's favorite Star Trek movie.
Sure.
But as a science fiction fan, I mean, look, I've revisited First Contact many times, and I thoroughly enjoy watching it now. I do. I love when the battle on the deflector dish of the Enterprise.
That's one of my favorite scenes in any of the movies.
It's so cool. I mean, they just do things in that you've always wanted to see people walk around on the outside of the whole. And we did see a little bit of that at the end of Star Trek: The Motion Picture. It was so cool when the crew rises up and they're standing on the top of the saucer section. Well, the way they shot that and how it was all inverted, and it was a childhood fantasy made flesh.
I'll tell you what I love about that. What I love particularly about that sequence is the fact that so much of the Star Trek movies is so much rehash of things they've done better in the episodes. You know, it's true of the original series movies. It's true of the Next Generation movies that, you know, a really great episode of either series is better than any of the movies. You know, is my feeling. So it was so refreshing at First Contact to see something we hadn't seen before, which was using the feature film medium, but also coming up with an idea that was original on budget. Yeah, to do something really original. And it's a great place to set. It was the same way I felt about in Star Trek VI during the Zero-G
the assassination.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it was just like, oh, that's cool. I haven't seen that before. Right. That's clever.
Well, the opening shot of First Contact, that pullout from Patrick Stewart's eye, and then you see the whole gigantic innards of the Borg ship, and he's remembering what it's like to be Locutus again. That was awesome.
Yeah.
Come on.
I was there when they shot that. I remember that. That was great.
Yeah, it was great. And Jonathan Frakes talked about how here he was getting up to direct on the big screen, and how he'd looked back at all these different action films and looked at James Cameron's Aliens, and you could tell there was a joie de vivre in all the actors were clearly having a great time making that movie. I mean, so there's that element, and Alfred Woodard is great, and James Cromwell. I mean, we used to bitch and moan that that's not Zephram Cochrane, but you know, and the jukebox in Montana, but still, there's something about the movie as a whole where the cast is having such a good time, and it is fun to watch.
That's not Zephram Cochrane. That's Gene Roddenberry.
Right,
is who that is.
Yeah, just the way that in Generations, it's not Captain Kirk, it's Bill Shatner.
Right, that's correct.
And the score, the Jerry Goldsmith score, that piece of music when the Phoenix is launched, it's just, what a great piece.
Well, Jerry's never done a bad score for a Star Trek movie.
No.
I mean, he's done very few bad scores ever, but, you know, all his Star Trek scores are great in their own way.
But I want to know, when you guys were on Voyager and you wanted to bring the Borg in, how you went about sort of taking all this backstory and all this stuff that we'd seen before and funnel it into an interesting thing for the Voyager show, you know?
Well, I think that we knew that we wanted to bring in the Borg at some point. I think that had probably been in everybody's mind from the beginning. And the idea of just having them as an adversary, I mean, it had been done. And so I think they specifically looked at Borg, you know, and the Hugh character. And I think that was really in everybody's mind about what if he had stayed? You know, what And again, the trauma that Picard had been through, being in a fairly limited time that he was Borg. What if you were assimilated when you were that baby in the drawer?
Sure.
What if you had essentially grown up Borg and then find yourself amongst humans? And I think it also tapped into like Data and the Doctor and Odo in Deep Space Nine, non-humans who were trying to become more human.
Mm-hmm.
I think that was sort of a recurring theme on Trek, and Seven was essentially our, non-human trying to become more human, but not really happy about it. I mean, she wasn't like the Doctor in that he really wanted to be human. She actually kind of wanted to go back to being Borg for a good long time.
Because that's all she knew.
Because that's all she knew. And I think that was kind of the genesis of it. And I think Seven turned out to be a terrific character.
I would take a step backwards because I would say, I feel that Voyager was struggling the same way Next Generation did in its early days for who their villains were going to be. Mm-hmm. And it seems like there was reluctance to sort of, even though, it's the Delta Quadrant, that's where the Borg are from, let's try and... So you had the Kazon, which Michael Piller would be the first person to admit did not work.
Did not work.
Right.
And then you had, more interestingly, the Vidians, who were introduced Vidians, who were introduced in Faj, who are really interesting alien, but I'm not sure how many times you could really go to that well.
Mm-hmm. Well, that was the problem when having a premise of the show that we were heading in one straight line as fast as we could go.
Right.
And so having any kind of recurring villain or recurring character was always going to be a challenge.
Yeah.
But with the Borg, you could buy that they were all over the universe.
Sure.
And you could run into them as many times as you wanted to.
Yeah.
Well, I thought, it was what you guys were faced with after Borg. You did, I think you took the Borg in the direction they had to go in. Like, you had to go. And I thought 7 of 9, yes, when you see Jerry Ryan in her catsuit, it feels a little... Well, why is she here? But her character and her performance, I thought, were really terrific.
Agreed.
And it handled well throughout the rest of Voyager. And there's a lot of interesting mythology that the Borg were given, like Unimatrix Zero. Now, I might not have liked it because of where Q-Who was and how I liked them as being this locusts of the universe. But once you've moved away from that, I thought Voyager did some really compelling and interesting stuff with those characters. And with the Borg, and also species 8472,
the really scary species,
the really scary from fluidic space, which my theory was that the space amoebas from the Immunity Syndrome had taken over the entire.
You always have a theory, Rob,
and they're even more scary to the budget.
But I thought you guys did some really really interesting stuff. How did those develop? How did you guys develop? Like when you decided to bring on 7 of 9. Did you have any kind of an arc, or did you have a direction you wanted, some vague notions of where you were going to take that character? And
well, I think, again, the general arc was that she was going to become more human, but in a way she was going to do it kicking and screaming. That she really, did not want to be taken from the collective. It's not like she was coming to us saying, please rescue me. I mean, we grabbed her and we pulled her out, and she was not happy about it. And I think that also helped us get around the premise that in the future, humans don't have conflicts with each other, because she could have as much conflict as she wanted to.
Right.
And so she was a character, again, kind of like the Doctor, that we could give all these rude, snarky comments to because she could get away with it without violating kind of the Roddenberry directive. So I think that we all kind of saw it as fun, as a chance to have a socially incorrect and awkward character who could be hostile. And we all just clung to that because you didn't have that opportunity pretty much anywhere else in Trek.
You also did a good job of showing young Annika and her family and what happened to her and how horrifying that really was.
Yeah.
When I always liked the fact that you guys went there and really delved into that.
Yeah, that it was a trauma, again, like Picard, it was this traumatic experience. But in a way, it became like a Stockholm syndrome kind of thing, in that she became identified with her captors. And so when she was rescued from them, she didn't want to go.
Yeah, I think it's a very imaginative character. I mean, it really filled it gave Voyager what it needed, which was its Spock, its Data, it's I wouldn't even say it's Odo, because I feel like Deep Space Nine is his own beast. It didn't really, everyone was an outsider in that show in a good way.
It's a character that helps us reflect on what it is to be human.
And Jerry's performance obviously is great, and it gave the show a lot of life. Now, obviously, there was a tendency to lean on that character, perhaps a little too much, but it was a very effective addition to the show. And like you said, it's like for a show that's always moving, it's it's very hard to define the Delta Quadrant because
every time you meet someone again, it makes the galaxy smaller.
Smaller, exactly.
And also, there's an interesting thing that happened with the Borg, the actresses that played the Borg Queen, bringing, of course, Alex Krieger back at the end, and Captain Janeway. Janeway now had a Koloth or a foil that she could revisit.
And then Susanna Thompson also played the Borg Queen.
And she was great too. Mm-hmm. And it was really interesting to see. Look, once I've moved away from my prejudicial ideas about what the Borg
because both are true. What you said is true,
yes.
But then if you're going to accept that that's not the direction they go in, and they're also making a TV series that has to be sustainable, then the way they dealt with it is also legitimate.
Right, absolutely. But I always thought that was kind of neat, bringing the last episode of the show when you're dealing with Janeway having to go back and confront the actual bringing back the real Borg Queen. It was really I thought it was pretty cool. I mean, it's funny because I have been revisiting Voyager episodes. We were not big fans of it when it was first on, and I have gone back and I've sort of watched it out of sequence without any preconceived notions. I find myself going back to Voyager more than any other Star Trek series on Netflix because I just don't know them as well. And episodes like Blink of an Eye or Living Witness are some of my favorite Star Trek episodes ever. And you go back and you watch these two-parters like Workforce, 1 and 2. I don't know why I love that episode so much, but I do. There's a lot of really interesting science fiction concepts on that show, and I think the Borg episodes really got into dealing with transhumanism and virtual realities and where we're moving as people. And I think they're more fascinating to me now the more I watch them. And
well, it's funny because it's funny you say that because in the course of I was for a long time very dismissive of Voyager, and particularly when I was researching my books. And Ed was writing the Voyager chapters, and we were talking to people, and it was always my go-to joke. I love Star Trek except for Voyager. But over the course of like talking to people and fans and meeting fans and doing research, what I've come to find is that the show had such a profound impact on a generation of women who, for the first time, had a role model in Kate Mulgrew's character, Janeway, and then also that it had the same kind of impact. The way Shatner was sort of at Kirk, a role model for us, an aspirational character, that it had the same impact of wanting to go into the sciences, wanting to go into engineering, into all this kind of STEM, all because of Voyager. And I reassess my dismissiveness of the show, and it's because it really was very eye-opening to kind of see that kind of thing. Now, I wouldn't argue that it's my favorite Star Trek series. It's not, but I'm a lot less dismissive of it, and I've gone back in the episodes I've rewatched. Many of them I adore. But
I think a lot of it has to do with what introduces you to Star Trek.
Sure.
Next Generation is what introduced me, and so that's my favorite series. I imagine if you started with Deep Space Nine or with Voyager, it might be something similar, because to you that's sort of the canon. That's the real Star Trek, and then these other things are just kind of pretenders. And so I think that it's true that if Voyager was kind of your entry Star Trek, then it probably again seems to you like the authentic Trek.
Yeah, I mean, it's like James Bond. I mean, there's the same axiom. It's like your favorite James Bond is whichever one you grew up on. So if you're a millennial, then you love Daniel Craig. If you grew up watching on the ABC Sunday Night Movie, then Sean Connery, and there's the generation, or Roger Moore. So it's and then nobody's favorite is Timothy Dalton. And I say that, and then somebody's going to write on Twitter, I love Timothy Dalton, and I didn't appreciate you criticizing.
Well, when Voyager started, it's now the fourth Star Trek TV series, and there were now Star Trek character tropes that we saw intermix, like B'Elanna Torres is half human, half Klingon, just like Spock was half Vulcan and half human. And so it was a show that was sort of a copy of a copy of a copy, while to us, when we were watching it.
We definitely felt it was a Xerox show.
It was definitely a Xerox show. So we never, it was doomed in our minds from the get-go. But as I've gone back and watched it, like it was John Ottman, who's the editor and composer for a lot of Bryan Singer movies. John Ottman is a big Voyager fan. And the guy, Marty, the dude who cut my hair for so long, he loved Voyager too. And I got a list from him. I said, send me your 10 favorite Voyager episodes. And that's what kicked me off going back and watching. And they really weren't the Borg episodes per se. There was a few 7 of 9 episodes. But there was a lot of really interesting episodes, and I don't even think I ever saw them on first run.
All stop. Shields to maximum. Stand by all weapons.
It's like a ghost ship.
They want us to reactivate a Borg ship.
Voyager, emergency beam out.
Commander! Get us out of here.
It's the Star Trek Voyager. You absolutely must watch.
That plays into a theory that Brian Fuller talks about in our book, which was that Voyager is the favorite series to a lot of gay men. Because I'm not sure, I forget how exactly he explains it, but talks about the fact that in Kate Mulgrew, there is the strength of leadership without the machismo, and it's something that they're very attracted to. It's a very interesting theory, I thought.
That is interesting. It makes sense to me because yes, my two friends would definitely agree.
Yeah, well, that's why, because knowing John and your hairdresser, I suspect that it made me think of that.
Yes, and you might be right. And they 7 of 9 is also a character that people, I think, gravitated toward as well because she wasn't happy, and they didn't feel comfortable so much in her skin around the rest of these people and had to sort of make her way as an outsider.
The last time I saw John was at some Star Trek charity auction. And I remember there was a couple of things that weren't, this is a while ago, that wasn't selling, and it was for a good cause. So John and I just started buying everything because we were like trying to help the auction. It was like, I think one of Chase's auctions or something. And it was and I ended up with a bunch of signed Star Trek scripts, and I don't know what else. And it's like,
was this one of them?
No, that was not one of them, but it was some really dreadful episodes.
The Borg also, if I read Star Trek novels, probably more than I should. And I will admit it.
Not probably,
but
more than you should.
There is a trilogy of books, the Destiny trilogy by David Mack. And in that trilogy of books, the Borg invade the Alpha Quadrant en masse. They come back with 7,000 cubes.
Wow.
And
that's a lot of cubes.
They just lay waste to like they destroy delightful Star Trek planets like Deneva. Gets destroyed by the Borg. Half the Federation is just laid waste.
That was a delightful planet. Was this pre the parasites, the neural parasites?
No, that was
post neural
beautiful
parasites?
Planet. But so if you guys want to read, and it deals with the origins of the Borg, and not only is it great Star Trek, but it's just awesome science fiction.
I remember that time F. Scott Fitzgerald wrote this great. No,
I'm just saying that. I mean, and Peter David in his book Vendetta postulated that the Doomsday Machine was built for fighting the Borg.
I was just going to say I want to bring it back for a second to the Borg because we were talking about this before we came on the air or whatever you call streaming. I guess it's not like on the air; you're on the web, whatever we're doing. But you were talking about the fan fiction, or not even fan fiction, but the novels have dealt with the Borg and the origins of the Borg, whether it's the Reeve Stevens or Peter David. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Well, the Reeve Stevens. Shatner gets resurrected at the end of Generations using Borg technology.
Ooh,
and that was
that I want to say.
It was after the Ashes of Eden, and because of Spock, and they postulate V'ger had something to do with the origin of the Borg, and there's all kinds of cool
That's
stuff.
That's going to be in the
novels.
next director's edition.
Well, no, the theory was that the Voyager probe got in the influence of the Borg homeworld, and the Borg are the one that turned it into V'ger.
That's right.
Huh.
And now, how does Nomad play into this?
Well, no, he doesn't.
Tonru? No. Anyway, that's interesting. And of course, you were saying that Peter David also had a big Borg.
Well, in Vendetta, that deals a lot with Guinan and the Doomsday Machine from the original series.
When you were on the show, were you aware, did you read any, I mean, it was just in Discovery, they actually hired a Star Trek novelist, Kristen Beyer, a Voyager novelist, who was writing.
And her books are great.
Fan fiction. And so my question to you is, was this something you were aware of at all? I mean, obviously, when you're working on a show, you don't have time to do anything, let alone do your grocery shopping. But how much was there ever anything that came up? I'm sure you had people who wrote the novels coming to pitch to you, but
Oh yeah, we did. I was aware that there were novels, but no, I didn't read any of them. But I know that like Brian Fuller, I think, had read some of them, and because when we were sitting in the room, coming up with story ideas, of course, the most common, reaction to any story idea is, "Oh no, we did that." In season 6 of Next Generation. Oh no, in season 3 of Deep Space Nine. And I think Brian occasionally said, "Oh no, that was in a novel that's such and such," which we felt like we could do. That wasn't duplicating to us, because I guess for us it was just the TV shows and the movies were essentially the things that we could not. If it had been done in one of those, we couldn't do it again. But the novels, I think we felt were not as well known
because books aren't real.
Well, they're not considered canon, so you know, it's if it's not in the show. But it's really interesting because you think, okay, after Voyager, the Borg are done, right? Because Enterprise was a prequel, and the crew, Star Trek crew did not meet them until Next Generation. That's where you'd be wrong, because you overlooked Sweeps Month and didn't realize that if there was a way to bring back Star Trek's most popular adversary, they're going to find one. So, of course, the Borg do return in Enterprise.
But they met them in First Contact.
Right. That's the thing. The Borg and Enterprise are from the Borg sphere that was blown up, and some of it was frozen.
They are possessed of one mind.
You will be assimilated.
Driven by one will. And intent on destroying one ship.
They're charging weapons. Now!
Prepare for Enterprise's first encounter with the Borg.
Keep firing!
In the 1-hour Star Trek event where resistance is futile.
We've been boarded.
Next Star Trek Enterprise.
Right.
So it's canon.
So it is no, but my question to you is, it's amazing how they found a way to bring the Borg into a life will find a way into in Enterprise. I haven't seen the episode, but have anyone else?
It wasn't a bad episode. I mean, it did feel, they wanted to bring the Borg in, and it does feel a little forced, but there is a good canonical reason why they were there.
Right.
And that's one of the things that I liked, is that when people look, as the shows moved on and canon became more or less of a factor depending on what you were trying to do, it was nice that I could watch an episode like that and go, okay, I believe it. I understand why it's happening.
Yeah, it's reasonable.
Well, once you have time travel, pretty much anything is possible. You can say, oh, that was an alternate timeline.
Yeah.
For anything.
That's true.
And why the Borg don't feel the need, why do they have to travel to Earth and then time travel? Why don't they just go back in time at their homeworld and then...
Well, that's the real question, isn't it?
Why come to Earth?
Yeah.
Why run a gauntlet of
starships? Because there wouldn't be a movie if that was the case.
Because they're not pretty that quickly. Bright.
So let me ask you before we wrap up this fascinating conversation about the Borg. Favorite Borg episode? If you look at Borg, what's your favorite Borg episode, Rob?
You know what? I do have to say, just because watching it was so thrilling, is Best of Both Worlds Part 1. Because I was already scared of the Borg from 2 Who, and they made them, still, they were very, very scary. And when Patrick Stewart was turned into a Borg, I wasn't thinking to myself, like, I don't like the fact that they're making the Borg more human. At the time, I couldn't believe it. Like, people don't remember. You took the lead of your show and turned him into a Borg? I mean, this was shocking. It was shocking.
Well, people thought it was a contract negotiating play, that Patrick wanted more money, and now, and there actually is some truth to that.
Yes.
That Patrick was asking for more money, and it gave them the out to make Riker the captain and not bring Patrick if they couldn't come to terms with him.
I mean, all of that episode was shocking. Shelby and Riker, everything that was going on. I mean, it was a beautifully done episode of television in general.
And what Rob fails to mention is, now if you're watching it on Netflix, oh, that was cool. Boop.
Let's watch another
one. And then you watch the next episode. But then
in real time,
you had to wait.
Yeah, there hadn't been a Star Trek 2 part since the Menagerie, and here you are, and it's like you've been praying that one day the show's going to get good. It finally does, and it's like, oh my God, Captain Picard's a Borg, fire to be continued, and then 3 months you're waiting for the new season to start.
As Patrick Stewart said, he was driving on PCH. And like a convertible or something, and a car had pulled up next to him, and someone turned in the car and said, "You've ruined my summer." It's like,
it was the Who Shot JR of its time, definitely.
Yeah. Oh, I mean,
sure.
Yeah.
I have to go back farther and say that Q-Who is my favorite because of the fact that they were still unknown and creepy and scary, and they took a freaking core sample out of the D.
Yeah.
That was awesome.
That's awesome.
The visual effects by Image were amazing. Taking the deck apart. You hadn't seen that kind of damage to the Enterprise since Star Trek II, since the Reliant. It was like cutting into the.
And it was so precise.
Yeah.
The way it was just like sucked out at multiple.
I believe
decks.
that's blown
and
out,
it was
sir.
miniature work, so it was like they created the little people in the deck and everything. Was really cool. Now people take that for granted. You got the
really
beginning
cool unless you're one of those people.
Yeah, then that's kind of
sucked
sucks.
down into space.
Yeah. That's true. So what about you, Lisa?
I think I'm going to have to agree that Best of Both Worlds Part 1, because I was, a huge Trek fan, and watching it in real time and having that suspense was pretty awesome.
Wow, so I'm the tiebreaker. I mean, either I can tie it up with the Q-Who, or maybe I'll pick another episode. There is no other episode. It's either Q-Who or Best of Both Worlds or First Contact. I guess, or First Contact. But I would have to go with. Boy, I'm really torn, but I think I go with Best of Both Worlds Part 1 because of that larger gestalt, the whole idea of the to be continued, and the and what it meant to Star Trek: The Next Generation, cemented the legacy of the show as an important Star Trek show, the second greatest Star Trek show of all time. But there's so much about it that is important, and but I love Q-Who, and I could easily have gone with Q-Who because I agree that in terms of mood and atmosphere and creepiness, it's way better than Best of Both Worlds. But Best of Both Worlds has the better character drama. And, again, the Q thing is such a MacGuffin for it all. So with Best of Both Worlds, it's a little more earned and has that great teaser where they beam down to the planet that we're in the center of town. It's a giant crater that the Borg have taken a piece out of. It's a shame that they didn't arc things back then the way they do now, so that the original plan, which had been neutral zone, would lead to Times Squared, would lead to Q-Who would have been more planned out. But it was the late 80s, early 90s. It's like they didn't know anything back then.
It's true. We were ignorant.
We didn't know anything. But
I also think that the repercussions that it had on Picard, that they didn't just drop that. It wasn't just like this one-time experience, but that he kept, that was a significant trauma, and it did actually affect that character for episodes and movies to come.
I totally agree with that. It's such a great point because, you look at something as brilliant as City on the Edge of Forever, and, Edith Keeler dies, spoiler alert, and Captain Kirk is completely destroyed by, giving up the one true love of his life, the Tracy Vincenzo, the Diana Rigg, and the next week, there's no repercussions. He's off fighting the neural parasites, but in Operation Annihilate. But what's so awesome is that they dealt with and you could never see that kind of vulnerability in a Star Trek character before, where he is really dealing, and it's that cathartic moment where he finally, the captain, Patrick Stewart, Shakespeare, he breaks down over this traumatic experience he had. And the fact that they were able to, and it was very hard to get that greenlit, and the fact that Piller and Moore really went to the mattresses to get Family Made when everyone was fighting them, and they wanted some really dumb sci-fi B story to be added to justify it. I mean, thank God they got their way, because it's one of the great hours of Star Trek television, and it's exactly what Lisa said. You see there the seed of serialized television or serialized Star Trek being planted, and again, it's a character arc. It's not a story arc, and that's what's so great about it.
Well, it would have been also interesting. We were talking about earlier, the spokesperson for the Borg, that if the Borg were somehow affected by Locutus the way Picard was, and the Borg were actually altered, like they had a revelation. So the Borg, they were always trying to do offshoots, like these Borg were cut off so they'll be different. But what if the whole collective learned something from Picard that they didn't know before, and they became even more dangerous, or they developed human desires about they wanted to conquer suddenly, instead of conquest being built into their sort of DNA or whatever.
What if they wanted revenge?
Well,
or something like that.
I think First Contact does deal with that a little bit by the Queen talking about Locutus. a little bit. Touches on that just,
Well, I'm
just
glad
a bit.
that they brought back the Borg and not Mark Twain. Anyway, I just want to say that this has been a fantastic discussion about the Borg. I really want to thank our special guest, Lisa Klink, for being here with us. And I hope you'll come back to talk about other corners of the Star Trek universe. We don't just have to talk about Voyager. As a longtime Next Generation fan, it'd be great to have your insights in the future.
Absolutely. I'd love to come back.
That would be great. And I'm saying that with it's not a polite, like, oh, yeah, we'd love to have you come back, like they said to Paul Fix on Where No Man Has Gone Before.
Right.
Hey, we'd love to have you come back and play Dr. Piper.
Sometime.
Well, yeah. Sometime never. Like, we'd actually like to have you come back. So I want to, and of course, have it's always great to have Rob Burnett back, and he'll be back with us again soon. Darren, you can follow us on Twitter and Instagram at Inglorious Trek. And we'd love to hear what you have to say and ideas for future shows, or if you feel differently, who knows? Maybe you love Descent. You're listening to the wrong podcast, but maybe you do. And please rate us at 5 stars. And I shouldn't say that right after I've just insulted our audience. For those of you who weren't insulted, please.
For those 2 of you who weren't insulted,
please rate us 5 stars on Apple Podcasts. If not, don't. And there are new episodes of this podcast every Monday at 17:01 Eastern Standard Time. So make sure to subscribe so you don't miss an episode. And finally, a very special thanks to Bill Ritter and everyone here at the Electric Search Network for making this show possible. And on behalf of Darren, Robert, Lisa, and myself, we want to say, in every revolution, there is one man or woman with a vision. May your way be as pleasant. Let's see what's out there. Engage.
Sweetheart, all my prayers are for you. Good night, sweetheart, I'll be watching o'er you. Tears and parting may make us forlorn, but with the